Ezra, it's art. Everything has a meaning.
Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush. I'm Ryan Arey, and I'm going to explain the hidden meaning in The Mandalorian Season 3. This will make rewatching the season a totally new experience for you. Seasons 1 and 2 told self-contained adventures that built toward a simple ending. Luke takes Grogu, they save Navarro. But this season widened the scale to tell a more galactic story that involved religion, nationalism, faith, and God. So with so many themes being thrown into the mix, it's easy to get confused.
I am so confused right now.
So you might be asking yourself, what was the point of this? What was The Mandalorian Season 3 trying to say? Well, I'm going to explain a deeper meaning of the hidden symbolism on this show, and believe me, there is some deep symbolism in this season. So I had to talk to a Harvard theologian, Ryan Adams, to get it all straight. But I think that when we're done, you'll have a greater appreciation for the season and an idea of what's next and how Thrawn is going to react to the new Mandalore. First, to understand any work, I think you have to understand its creator, because filmmakers like Jon Favreau view the world through a particular lens, so we have to understand that particular worldview to understand how they interpret the world. Kind of like how watching The Fablemans makes you understand why Spielberg's E.T. was such a personal story.
Maybe you ought to call your father and tell him about it.
I can't. He's in Mexico with Sally.
You love Benny.
Don't you love Daddy?
Of course I love Dad, and I love Mom.
Then why is this all of a sudden happening?
For years, Jon Favreau was an actor before breaking through as a writer and then a director in the indie scene. Any movie he has written seems to come from a personal place for him. For example, his breakout hit, Swingers, which he wrote the screenplay for, was about a heartbroken actor in LA trying to make it in Hollywood. But he always seems most interested in telling the stories of fathers and sons. After Jon Favreau's mother died of leukemia when he was 13 years old, his father raised him as a single parent. Now, knowing this makes you see a lot of his work through a much different lens. His directorial debut, Made, which is also a great movie by the way, ends with his character becoming a single dad. Elf is about a son trying to reunite with his long-lost father. Buddy the Elf is loud and artistic, and his father is more of a serious professional. Now, I'm speculating, but there might be a parallel here to Favreau's relationship with his own father, who was a special education teacher and not really involved in the arts. Zathura's adventure begins because a single dad leaves his kids home alone. Favreau's Iron Man movies really highlight the estranged relationship between Tony and his dad.
He was cold, he was calculating. He never told me he loved me, he never even told me he liked me.
Now, I should note that this relationship is present in the comics, but it's not exactly like the highlight of every single issue. Whereas, Tony's daddy issues kind of permeate his story and the rest of the MCU until daddy issues became a joke on She-Hulk.
What's with all the daddy issues? We got Tony Stark, daddy issues.
Jen.
Thor, daddy issues. Loki, same daddy, same issues.
Oh boy.
In fact, much of Iron Man 2 centers around a message that Tony's dad left for him inside the shape of the Stark Expo. And that Stark Expo is right across the street from where Favreau's dad raised him.
And there's Flushing Meadow Park. I grew up right there. You just saw my building.
What else? All right, Cowboys and Aliens, not a very good movie, and to me always seemed like a gun-for-hire project for Favreau. But Favreau followed that up with a personal indie called Chef, about a single dad bonding with his son over his profession. It's a great movie, by the way, and pretty on the nose for what we're talking about. The Jungle Book is about a son being raised by single dads, and that son has to ultimately find his own path with his own people, similar to how Favreau left his father behind in Queens to live with artists in Los Angeles. There's also The Lion King, which at its heart is a father-son story. And then Favreau created The Mandalorian. He could have made a show about anything, but he chose it to be a father-son story. In Season 1, the father becomes a single parent, like Favreau's father did after the tragic loss of his mother. In Season 2, the son can't be with his father because he has to go away with his own people, the Jedi, like Favreau leaving the East Coast to become an actor in Los Angeles. And in Season 3, the father and son are finally able to live together as the show embraces John's Jewish roots. Oh, Jon Favreau is Jewish? Well, his dad is Catholic, but his mother was Jewish. Much like Bo-Katan, he walks in both worlds. His grandparents kept kosher, and John went to a Hebrew school. Now, after his mother passed away, his family wanted to make sure that he was still raised in the faith. Favreau told the site Forward, "When I was 13, a year or so after my mother passed away, I was bar mitzvahed. I had an aliyah, but I never actually read from the Torah, so I am bringing up my children Jewish by example." So let's look at The Mandalorian through this lens, the story of a single dad raising his kid in a new religion, as that religion is going through a transformative time. Just as for Favreau, he was bar mitzvahed at a formative time in the year of his mother's death. So I think this season of The Mandalorian was deeply personal for Jon Favreau. This might be why the storytelling seemed uneven at times, but I'll nitpick about that later in the video. For now, let's examine this season through this personal lens to really crack what the show is trying to say. Jon Favreau is a very referential director. I mean, look at this clip from his first movie, Swingers, where he makes fun of Tarantino and then steals from Tarantino.
How can you even compare the two, man? Tarantino completely buys everything from Scorsese.
He even said from the beginning that The Mandalorian was going to attempt to reference the same material that Lucas referenced.
When I went in, I said, look, I don't want to be influenced so much by Star Wars. You know, we definitely want to be consistent with Star Wars, but I want to be influenced by the stuff that influenced George.
The very first Mandalorian, Boba Fett, was already a referential character. He combined the look of a revisionist Western hero like Clint Eastwood in the Man with No Name trilogy with the helmet of a knight errant. So, I mean, the first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian were kind of hybrids of different stories. They combined the helmet of the knight errant, the do-gooding quest of a classic Western, and the gritty look and world of a revisionist Western. And like all of Star Wars, these first 2 seasons were heavily influenced by samurai films, especially the works of Akira Kurosawa. But like, I'm gonna stop myself there because I could fill up a whole video with cinematic influences of The Mandalorian, and I probably will make that video. So those are some of the superficial influences for this series, but now let's look at the deeper cultural story that is a reflection of the Jewish faith. So let's explore a very brief history of Judaism. First, a little background on me. I am not Jewish. I was raised as something Methodist, but I know a fair bit about theology. I made a documentary about an Indian Jewish artist and have many friends of different faiths. But I am out of my depth on the history of Judaism, so I had a long conversation with an old friend of mine, Harvard theologian Ryan Adams. Not that Ryan Adams, this one. Sorry. Ryan had some theories and interpretations of this season that blew my mind. But first, we're going to speed run through Jewish history up until the point that's relevant for this video. Be warned, I am going to leave out a lot of stuff. First, let's start with the Abrahamic promise, when God basically makes a covenant with Abraham and says in Genesis 12, I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. And he tells Abraham that if he keeps God in his heart, then he will be blessed and given land. But God tells him, according to Ryan Adams,
Lech lecha, which means like get up and go.
And that is where history kind of first marks Jews as these disparate people who often find themselves looking for a home. In Genesis 15, God tells Abraham, look now toward heaven and count the stars if you are able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. So this idea, connecting the Jewish people with these stars in the sky, is echoed in the book of Boba Fett.
Our people are scattered like stars in the galaxy.
Eventually, Abraham settles in the land of Canaan, and his grandson Jacob has 12 sons, and those sons go forth and multiply to become the 12 tribes of Israel. Very long story short, the Jewish people moved to Egypt, where over time they were enslaved. Then a Jew named Moses was born and then raised to be part of the Pharaoh's family. Moses kills a man who is harming a Hebrew slave, so he flees Egypt, and then God appears to him as a burning bush and tells him to liberate his people from bondage. Moses then warned the Pharaoh that God would visit 12 plagues upon Egypt until his people were liberated. So Pharaoh lets them go, then changes his mind. Moses parts the Red Sea and leads his people to Mount Sinai, where he received their laws, the 10 Commandments. But because the people had fallen to idol worship and disbelief in God's promises, God cursed them to wander the desert for 40 years until a new, deserving generation could arise and enter their homeland. Now, look, for a lot of non-Jews like myself, that's where our knowledge tends to stop, right at the end of the Charlton Heston movie.
Go, proclaim liberty throughout all the lands, unto all the inhabitants thereof.
Now, earlier I mentioned the 12 tribes because it is very important to note that for hundreds of years, Jews have never been a monolithic group. Different Jews left their homeland for different reasons over the years and developed their own interpretation of the Tanakh, or the book Christians would call the front half of the Bible. For instance, I know Jews who are atheists but still have bar mitzvahs. There are Jews that are modern Orthodox or non-secular. As Ryan says,
the scope of belief in Judaism is so wide, and the spectrum of where everyone falls, you know, it's not just an XY axis, it's an XYZ, there's a fifth dimension. It's really fascinating.
And in the past, we've talked about ultra-Orthodox Jews, or the Hasidim, which means the pious ones in Hebrew. These are Jews that follow a much more observant form of the law, following the laws of Moses to the letter. And I bring this up because Orthodox Jews are definitely analogous to the Children of the Watch. You see, the Children of the Watch and their laws are not from the Clone Wars or any comic book. They were created for this show by Jon Favreau, and I think that he always intended for them to be a reinterpretation of ultra-Orthodox Jews. So let's run through a few examples before we put this entire season in a real-world historical context. Just listen to how Ryan explains how,
in order for the Mandalorian to purify himself, he has to bathe in the living waters. That's a mikvah, which is like a Jewish ritualistic bath.
Observant Jews also follow the halakha, which translates to the way. Sound familiar?
This is the way.
And you know how the Children of the Watch keep talking about walking the path of the Mandalore? The Mandalore was a guy, like a real person, the father of their religion, much like Abraham was. So they are called the Mandalorians in his name, just as the Jews are called the children of Abraham. And then there's Din's quest at the start of this season.
I can bring you proof that I have bathed in the living waters beneath the mines of Mandalore. The decree of exile will be lifted and I would be redeemed.
Like Ryan said, this is a mikveh, a purifying bath that you take in the Mayim Chaim, which in Hebrew means the living waters. Now, I recently watched a great panel called the Mando Orthodox, where a few Jewish scholars and massive Star Wars geeks went deep into all this symbolism. The link for that is below, by the way. In that panel, Jen Levine connected this process of atonement to Yom Kippur.
He still believed in it. He still believed, I have the ability to be redeemed. I believe in my own ability to access this pure part of myself by going through this ritual that's so important to my culture. And it's very much the way we view it in Judaism as well.
Now, remember the oath that we hear Ragnar taking that Din repeated during his bath in the living waters?
I swear on my name
In the names of the ancestors.
that I shall walk the way of the Mandalore
And the words of the creed shall be forever forged
in my heart.
This is very similar to a prayer that observant Jews say every day, which is from Deuteronomy 6:9. Take to heart these instructions which I charge you this day. Impress them upon your children. Recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Another way of saying, forge this creed onto your heart.
They're the same picture.
And remember the ending when Din wants Grogu to have the privileges of being an apprentice? The armorer says,
"He is too young to speak, so he is too young to take the creed."
And Ryan had a pretty clear interpretation of that.
He can speak Hebrew, so he can't do a bar mitzvah.
But the most eliminating thing that Ryan told me about Orthodox Jews is the reason they stayed so traditional.
Many of those Orthodox Jews came here to America because they were fleeing horrendous persecution in other places. And they came here, and in a new world with new people, they said to themselves, the most important thing that we do is keep our ways together. They don't say old ways, they say their ways.
And we see the same reaction to persecution from the Children of the Watch. Their world was destroyed. They experienced a Holocaust at the hands of an evil empire filled with space Nazis, so there are obvious parallels to the Roman Empire and Nazi Germany. But, as we'll talk about later on, the historical parallels are far less obvious than Moses and World War II. But also, I want to credit The Mandalorian for dealing with Din's religious practices in such a respectful way. And look, I'll be honest, the Mando Orthodox talkback made me a little ashamed of my earlier assumptions about this show. Let me explain. See, they pointed out that the show never revealed Din's face, even when he's alone. Much like Hasidic Jews, they don't remove their head coverings just because they're by themselves. You're not supposed to be naked before God. It is a very subtle way that the show itself acknowledges and accepts Din's religion. And then the panel went on to point out that there was a very Western Christian assumption that Din would eventually stop using his helmet and go join like the larger culture. And I was one of those people. I said this in one of our Easter egg videos, that maybe Din would leave his silly cult and join Bo-Katan after season 2, which was very close-minded of me. We see time and time again that Din has to explain his religion to others.
I don't know how you people wear those things. And by you people, I do mean Mandalorians.
While he himself is extremely tolerant of other cultures, and he even speaks Tusken.
What are you doing?
Negotiating.
And remember how the mainstream religion in the galaxy thought of the Tuskens?
They're like animals, and I slaughtered them like animals.
Well, they cover their faces too, so I guess there's a kind of kinship there.
That there is. Now, the observant Mandalorians don't have any dietary restrictions like Orthodox Jews do, but they do have dining restrictions.
When you get your food, you go off to find a place where you can take off your helmet.
And this is adapted from another Jewish custom. The Tisha B'Av, sorry if I mispronounced that, is the saddest day on the Jewish calendar, when once a year they mourn the destruction of the Second Temple. During this time, there is a separation in the afternoon where you eat alone on a low stool, dipping a hard-boiled egg in ashes. But the biggest clue that the Mandalorians are space Jews was the most obvious. For centuries, the Jewish people have fled from persecution, from the Egyptians, from the Babylonians, the Crusades, the pogroms, the Nazis, the list goes on and on. And in The Mandalorian, we meet a group of people who are travelers, hiding in the shadows. In season 1, they're nearly wiped out, but they persist, they survive, and eventually they thrive. And nothing sums up the Jewish spirit better than that. So let's talk specifically about season 3 and about the historical context that inspired this season of The Mandalorian. Now look, I am going to point out several events from history that seem to be evoked by The Mandalorian, but I should note that I don't think Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni necessarily are doing like a straight up comparison or retelling of history here, like how Ryan tells us.
It's not a one-to-one parallel. You can't really make direct expectations of like, well, these guys are the the very specific cult like most observant. It's really this back and forth, because the Mandalorian culture is its own culture, but it seems to be riding a very parallel path to these Jewish stories.
Instead, just like all of Star Wars, I think they mix and match different parts of history to tell a unique story. Now, before we get into the historical context of this season, forward columnist Alex Zelda made a great point about Death Watch and the Clone Wars. So if you haven't seen Clone Wars, here's a very brief summary. Mandalore was ruled by pacifist new Mandalorians who did not seriously observe any type of ancient customs. Maybe like in a ceremonial way, as Bo-Katan described her mikveh as a child.
I took the creed and was showered with gifts.
But Bo-Katan, as a teenager, abandoned her family to join a traditional group called Death Watch. Now these were more violent Mandalorians who lived on the moon Concordia and who eventually overthrew the pacifist government and, well, they caused a lot of problems. The panel made a great point that Death Watch are very similar to the Sicarii.
Who's the Sicarii?
So, the Sicarii were a group of violent zealots who opposed the Roman occupation, and we're talking like 60, 70 AD-ish here. They attacked Romans wherever they could, and they even killed their own people who were Roman sympathizers. Now, the Sicarii did briefly retake the city of Jerusalem from the Romans, but the Romans retaliated, destroying the Second Temple in 70 AD. So, the Star Wars parallel of the Sicarii are Death Watch, the extremist group that retook control of Mandalore during the Clone Wars. And the Galactic Empire leveled the planet after Bo-Katan led a rebellion against the occupying forces, similar to how the Roman Empire leveled a site with great religious meaning to the Jews, the Second Temple. Pre Vizsla might even have a real-life parallel with Simon Bar Kokhba, and I'm really sorry if I mispronounced that wrong. So Simon was a total badass, leader of the Bar Kokhba rebellion against the Roman Empire, and he succeeded for about 3 years before the Romans killed him. But the main lesson that Bo-Katan takes from all of this is that infighting among her people is what destroyed their culture.
Mandalore has always been too powerful for any enemy to defeat. It is always our own division that destroys us.
And this is essentially the biggest problem the Jewish people have had throughout history: factionalism.
Literally, in Judaism, the teaching that the Second Temple was destroyed was because of Jews hating one another.
So, all of that history of Death Watch and Bo-Katan lays the groundwork for this season, which kind of mixes and matches different periods of history. But Ryan told me his theory for this season was not based on the Roman era or even the time of Moses.
After seeing this finale, it seems to me that this is very clearly an allegory for the Babylonian exile and the return to Jerusalem.
I had no idea what he was talking about, so I asked him to elaborate. So I knew the story of King David. You probably do too, or at least you know the part about David and Goliath. What I didn't know is that David's son built the first temple in Jerusalem because his son was a peaceful man and David was more all about war, and thus he was unworthy to build the temple. Now that first temple contained an eternal flame that miraculously stayed lit at all times. But, as Ryan says,
as the kingdom becomes bigger and more fraught and a part of the world, it becomes more corrupt. Prophets are sent to try and steer them back towards the way. Basically, God says, I'm going to take you out of this land that I gave you because of the way you've been acting.
Again, Jewish factionalism became their downfall as the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple and the Jewish people were scattered, now living in Babylon for hundreds of years. So Babylon is this area in modern-day Iraq, and it's also where parts of the Eternals took place. So Nebuchadnezzar destroys the temple, scatters the people, and extinguishes the eternal flame.
They live in Babylon. They live with the people who destroyed them.
And this is where it gets very interesting. After about 70 years, a new Persian king, Cyrus the Great, allows the Jews to return home and gives them money to rebuild their temple. But they had spent 70 years in Babylon, integrated with the locals. They had lost their way.
There is only one way.
So, thinking that your homeland is cursed and not wanting to return, who does that sound like?
That planet is cursed. Anyone who goes there dies.
Now, I should also note at this point that in one of our videos, I said that Din's people were like ultra-Orthodox, anti-Zionist Jews. These are basically a subset of Jews who did not want Israel to be rebuilt because they were waiting for the Messiah to rebuild the nation and believed that Israel was more of a spiritual state. So, we mistakenly thought that that was the parallel for Din's group that didn't want to return to Mandalore. But now, it actually looks like the parallel was with these Babylonian Jews. So then, enter a priest named Ezra.
Ezra is a famous scribe who reteaches the people of Israel how to be Jewish. And I feel like Ezra and the armorer are pretty connected.
So Ezra reteaches these Jews the old ways, teaches them how to be more devout, how to rededicate themselves to the way, which is very similar to the armorer who becomes a spiritual leader to her people following the wake of a giant disaster.
When one chooses to walk the way of the Mandalore, you are both hunter and prey.
And then the Jewish ruler Nehemiah was key in rebuilding Jerusalem and building the Second Temple. And if you're looking for another possible parallel, Bo-Katan's journey in Season 3 is a lot like Nehemiah's. Just as Nehemiah, the ruler, worked with the priest, Ezra, Bo-Katan, the ruler, worked with the religious leader, the armorer. So Bo-Katan rebuilds the temple, the Great Forge, and relights the sacred eternal flame, just like Nehemiah did. I mean, remember the reverence the armorer used to talk about the forge?
Here stood a simple one. Yet they were both forges. They served the same purpose.
The eternal flame in the Great Temple was also very important to the Jewish people. Every synagogue has its own flame that stays lit, even as the diaspora was scattered around the world. Even the armorer's small forge was a symbolic extension of that great forge on Mandalore, just as in synagogues they light the menorah in reverence to the light of God. But back to the Babylonian Jews. Around this time, there was a debate about what it actually meant to be Jewish.
When all the Jews returned to Israel, Ezra and Nehemiah start basically looking through, and none of the Jews that have come remember the old ways. Some of them don't even speak Hebrew. And so a whole fight begins within the community about what do we do with intermarried people.
And I bring this up because the Mandalorians have the same debate this season.
A misguided zealot possesses the blade. One, I might add, who has not one drop of Mandalorian blood in his veins.
Again, this could all be a coincidence, but when you consider that Favreau went to Hebrew school and he was raised in the faith, there is like no way these parallels were not on his mind when he wrote this story. But like I said, these are not like one-to-one parallels. This season also has a fair bit of symbolism from Exodus and the Torah, that's the books of Moses. For instance, there was the Mandoa tablet in episode 1. A very patient and clever Redditor translated this tablet and found that it contained parts of a passage from the book of Exodus. After I read this passage to Ryan, he told me,
That is the plague of locusts.
Which I was familiar with, because of movies. The locusts were one of the 10 plagues that God brought down upon Egypt. But Ryan went on to explain that the movies don't really do the plagues justice.
The Ten Commandments movie does not nail the truly miraculous nature of what the Exodus was supposed to be.
So when you go back through this season, we do see events similar to these plagues. The plague of locusts is like the computer virus in episode 6. Mandalore is covered in a storm cloud like the plague of hailstones. The parasite in the first episode is taking away Din's blood, very similar to the water of the Nile turning to blood, as Din's blood becomes a kind of life-giving force for this creature. There's also a giant monster in the 7th episode, which Ryan likens to the plague of beasts.
There's an old Jewish story that it was one giant frog, a kaiju-like frog, that, broke the brains of the Egyptians. When the wild beasts showed up, they weren't just like, oh look, Bob's oxen got out. It was animals they'd never seen before. It was elephants coming in to basically send a message to the Egyptians that you don't mess with the Jews. Their God is protecting them.
So you might say some of those are a reach, but the final plague is entirely present in the finale. God killed the firstborn of every house who did not protect their home with lamb's blood. And Gideon suffers the death of his firstborns, his clones.
You smothered them before they could draw their first breath.
And by far, the most direct mention of the Torah was from the chapter called The Spies.
Yeah, who were the spies? Was it the armor? I bet it was the armor, as so many have speculated.
No, now look, I've been kicking myself for this for about a week, but the day we put up our Easter egg video for the finale, a woman named Aliyah contacted me and told me about the 12 spies in the Book of Numbers. Now I've seen this mentioned all over the internet, but I want to credit the first person who told me about this. So, in episode 7, Bo-Katan leads a party of 12 Mandalorians, which at the time we said, oh, that's like the 12 tribes of Israel or the 12 apostles of Christ.
Right.
Wrong.
Oh.
These were a representation of the 12 spies that Moses sent into the land of Canaan to scout the land. This is following their 40 years of wandering around in the desert. So these 12 were princes from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, just like Bo-Katan's group was made up of different sects. She was very clear about that requirement.
I need volunteers from both tribes.
Now, the parallels do kind of end there, because God struck down 10 of the spies for not believing the land was bountiful, but you get the idea. 12 spies.
So where does Moff Gideon figure into all this?
Okay, I'll talk about Moff Gideon, but then I want to explain how all of this could tell us what is up with Thrawn and what role Grogu will play in this rebuilt Mandalore hundreds of years in the future. First, Gideon. He is very much like Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king who destroyed the first temple. Now, there was also a biblical Gideon who was a Jewish war hero who destroyed shrines to Baal so his own son could become king. And this is where we get a hint about Moff Gideon. He is somebody who extinguished a native religion to establish himself as ruler and God. Not only that, but he was going to establish his clones, his sons, as rulers after him. Moff Gideon is the inverse of Judaism. Judaism is centered around community and working together. But Moff Gideon is alone. So alone, in fact, that he only wants to clone himself, so he becomes the ultimate power in the universe. In effect, this would make him God. The one, the only, the great I am. And remember the speech Gideon gives about taking from other cultures?
You see, every society has something to offer. By aggregating the best of each, I will create an army that will bring order to the galaxy.
This is called syncretism. It's when a culture begins to appropriate and meld other cultures and religions together. Syncretism was at the heart of that Second Temple debate about what does it mean to be Jewish. Gideon wants to erase local customs and replace them with his own way, similar to how in the show Andor the Empire relocated the natives of Aldhani to make room to build a bigger base. And the inverse of Moff Gideon is Bo-Katan. She begins the series very locked into her own worldview. She looks down on Din Djarin for his religious beliefs.
Children of the Watch are a cult of religious zealots that broke away from Mandalorian society.
And she begins this season with no faith in her people or in their sacred traditions, like the belief in the Darksaber.
Wave that thing around, and they'll do whatever you say.
But then in episode 2, during Din's baptism, she seems to have this reverence for what's happening.
And the words of the creed shall be forever forged.
And following this, she has her own holy vision of a divine presence, the Mythosaur.
It is a noble vision.
And this is what leads her to bringing her people together. Kind of like the Jewish Catholic Jon Favreau, she walks in both worlds. Also, Gideon dies in a crucifix pose, so make your own conclusions about that. But now let's talk about what's next, because Ryan had some interesting thoughts on that. Historically, the Second Temple was destroyed following the Bar Kokhba revolt. That's the revolt that I talked about earlier. And this revolt was put down by a Roman general named Titus, who destroyed the temple and scattered Jewish culture from Jerusalem.
And when I think about this, I think about Thrawn.
Now, Thrawn is an Imperial Admiral who mostly has appeared in novels, but was also the heavy in Star Wars Rebels. And he was teased in Episode 7 as the big bad of this entire mini-saga.
Grand Admiral Thrawn's return will herald in the re-emergence of our military.
Thrawn is going to be in the show Ahsoka, played by Lars Mikkelsen, and he will likely be the villain in Dave Filoni's Mandoverse movie. But Ryan went into more detail about why he thinks Thrawn is the perfect parallel to Titus.
If there's ever a parallel to the man who destroys the Second Temple, it's Grand Admiral Thrawn. You know, an emissary of a larger imperial organization who's sent to put down the rebellious, zealous people who just got their homeland back. That's Thrawn.
So, that's down the road, but let's go back to the immediate ending of this season and how Grogu might actually be a tiny little Moses figure, or maybe even the Jewish Messiah. The season ends with a period of relative peace. As described in the book of Isaiah, the Mandalorian Din Djarin has bent his sword into a plowshare, choosing a life of peace over war. But in this case, that bent sword is the Darksaber itself. The Darksaber is an important relic to the Mandalorians because it was once wielded by the first Mandalorian Jedi, Tar Vizsla. He then united Mandalore under his rule. Constant wars were fought over the Darksaber, so its destruction symbolizes an era of peace. In other words, they're going to stop fighting with swords and instead till the land to make it grow again. We even see an underground farm in this episode, hinting toward a life of farming and peace to come on Mandalore.
These are the old species indigenous to Mandalore.
So remember, the Mandalorians have been a historical enemy of the Jedi. Many of their weapons were created to fight Jedi Knights. So when I think of Tar Vizsla, an ancient ruler who walked in two worlds who united his people behind a holy object, I think of Moses. Moses was raised by the Egyptian royal family. He walked in the world of the enemy, like Tar Vizsla, and the Ten Commandments were the holy objects that governed his people, like the Darksaber. The Ten Commandments also burned anyone alive who was unworthy and dared to touch the Ark of the Covenant, kind of like what happens in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Just as the Darksaber has a way of being too heavy for people who are unworthy to wield it, and how it often brought destruction to its people. But that Manda Orthodox panel also described that little Grogu has some of the qualities of Moses. Like Tar Vizsla, he is a Mandalorian Jedi who walks in both worlds. Like Moses, he is a survivor of a Holocaust who was rescued in a basket. Moses also had trouble speaking, and his brother Aaron was his interpreter, much like IG-12 interprets for Grogu.
Yes, 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 yes.
And in the final episode, we see Grogu have a spiritual connection with the Mythosaur, giving us this idea that he does have a sort of divine connection. The channel New Rockstars even pointed out that when he parts the flames, as Moses parted the Red Sea, the musical chord progression echoes the score from the Prince of Egypt. But, like I said, the Mandalorians already have their Moses. I think the Grogu is more likely a symbol for the Messiah. And look, I am in way over my head talking about the Messiah, but here's the TLDR. The Jews believe that the Messiah will come someday and lead the world into lasting peace and prosperity. Zephaniah 3:9 reads, "For then I shall turn for the nations a clear tongue, so that they will all proclaim in the name of the Lord and to worship him with a united resolve." Christians believe the Messiah has already come and his name was Jesus. But I see Grogu as this potential leader of the Mandalorians, somebody who has a spiritual connection, who has walked in many worlds, who was there for the construction and probably destruction of the Second Temple. But I also think that when the time comes for Grogu to wear a helmet, that he might refuse. Part of the history of Judaism is this push and pull between the old ways and the new. Basically, it's the entire plot of Fiddler on the Roof.
How can I turn my back on my faith? If I try and bend that far, I'll break.
In Fiddler on the Roof, Tevye is constantly resisting his daughter's new ideas of how the world should function, like when they resist an arranged marriage. The thing is, the themes in that musical are easily understood by any traditional culture, in Japan, China, South Asia, heck, even Midwestern parents who think their kids are getting way too many woke ideas off that TikTok. The point is, I see Grogu as another opportunity to tell a story that is universal, but has its roots in Jewish culture. And finally, I want to talk about what I mentioned at the top of this video, that I think this season was deeply personal for Jon Favreau. Now, we made a lot of videos this season talking about how uneven the storytelling was and how characters seemed to lack agency or clear motivation. Like, we never really know what Din and Grogu want, you know? Now, I personally think the season was a lot of fun, but it didn't do a great job explaining world building to casual fans. And I think that if I'm right about this being personal for Favreau, it explains why the season was told in such a strange way. Every commercial artist has a story that they want to tell that's personal to them. It's their dream project. Oftentimes this project is about their heritage, their parents, or their own life experience. Like, one pretty extreme example is Battlefield Earth. John Travolta is a devoted Scientologist, and he dreamed of starting a mega franchise penned by Scientology's founder, L. Ron Hubbard. Now, he nailed the ideology of the book, I guess, but he just kind of forgot to make a movie good or to include compelling characters. Now, Mandalorian Season 3 is way better than Battlefield Earth, but you can kind of tell that Favreau started with this ending in mind, and then he worked backwards from there. Sometimes when a writer knows the ending ahead of time, they might take shortcuts to get there, instead of stopping to explain Bo-Katan's backstory or to let us know what Din and Grogu actually want out of all this. But then again, I could just be nitpicking. What is truly fascinating about all of this is how very deeply Star Wars all this is. Star Wars has always taken from many cultures and genres to create one story that's universal. It combines aspects of war films, westerns, samurai, Eastern faith, Christian symbolism, and creates one singular story that's relatable to the entire human race. And that is the point of The Mandalorian Season 3. But I want to hear from you guys down in the comments below or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe, smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Arey.